As virtuous men pass mildly away and whisper to their souls to go, while some of their sad friends do say the breath goes now, and some say no. So let us melt and make no noise, no tear floods nor sigh tempest move, 'twere profanation of our joys to tell the laity our love. Moving of the earth brings harms and fears, men reckon what it did and meant, but trepidation of the spheres, though far greater, is innocent. Dull sublunary lovers' love, whose soulless sense cannot admit absence, because it doth remove those things that elemented it. But we by a love so much refined that ourselves know not what it is, enter assured of the mind, careless eyes, lips, and hands to miss. Our two souls, therefore, which are one, though I must go, endure not yet a breach, but an expansion, like gold to airy thinness beat. If they be two, they are two so as stiff twin compasses are two. Thy soul, the fixed foot, makes no show to move, but doth if the other do. And though it in the centre sit, yet when the other far doth roam, it leans and hearkens after it, and grows erect as that comes home. Such wilt thou be to me, who must like the other foot obliquely run. Thy firmness makes my circle just, and makes me end where I begun. So last time when we were discussing this poem, we were doing, or I should say you were doing, a really good job of showing how all the various metaphors that Donne presents to us in the beginning of the poem are connected to each other, right? So we start with the image of the virtuous man who's dying, but his attention, like his gaze, is upwards towards the heaven, and we talked about that idea imaginatively in this poem of the Ptolemaic universe and the idea of the moon being the mark between what is earthbound, imperfect, and temporal, and subject to decay, physical things, and those things that are perfect and eternal and enduring that exist beyond the level of the moon. His attention is on his uh, is on his soul, that part of him that corresponds with the eternal, and he has accepted the inevitability of his death. His sad friends who are looking downwards towards him, their attention is on his physical body. And what we see with them is they're sad and they're also confused. They don't know whether he's died or not. Elsewhere in the poem, we find that same idea reiterated in some of the metaphors when we see, for example, the moving of the earth. And you were all quite right that is actually describing an earthquake, and one that probably a reference to an earthquake that struck in southern England sometime before Donne wrote this poem, but one that really seemed to capture people's imaginations. And for many years after that earthquake, there were people, including members of the clergy, who would try to figure out what that earthquake meant. Was it a warning from God? Was it some kind of a sign? They tried to reckon what it did and meant. And what we find is they, like the sad friends, were in a state of kind of confusion. Their gaze was downward towards the earth, towards the physical, and as a result, they were left with confusion, ignoring the fact that there were far greater movements in the spheres, those, the heavenly bodies that exist beyond the moon, which are innocent of their gaze. They're not paying any attention to them. And also, they're innocent in the sense that they are that they're benevolent. They're not. They're harmless, and in fact assuring. And then we even looked at that in stanza two, that difference between what is profane, meaning outside the church, and what is sacred. And again, we have all these indications that their love, uh, the poet is saying to the person he's addressing, and I guess Isaac Walton is probably right. It was, we might as well assume he was. It was a poem that Donne wrote to his wife when they had to be separated. Their love can endure that separation of their physical selves because it's a love that resides in the soul. And then we get, endures not yet a breach, a break, but an expansion. And we talked about gold, and how a tiny little piece of gold can be beaten very, very thin to the point where it's as thin as gold leaf, which is so thin that if you turn it on its edge, it almost seems to disappear. In fact, when they're handling it, they very often we use static electricity to be able to to be able to pick it up and manipulate it so they can do, for example, the gold leafing in a book's binding, like gold to airy thinness beat. And then we talked about how gold uh, was really useful for this metaphor because it doesn't tarnish and it lasts forever. It becomes a good sign of the eternal. And you guys followed me right with that too. If I said, think of a gold symbol of eternal love, and you immediately went to wedding bands, which is I think where this poem wants us to go, especially as we get to that last image of the compass, which I'm going to talk about for a little bit now. Now, up until this point, this seems it's a strange poem. It's an intellectually difficult poem, but it seems kind of sweet, doesn't it? Their love can endure change. It can endure separation because it resides in the soul and not in their bodies, and the love will stay consistent even as they experience change. Maybe maybe we might think a little bit cliche. I mean, we really kind of saw the same thing in that Shakespeare sonnet, but sweet and lovely. Do you think Donne's going to let it stay there? He's not. We get to this last metaphor, and this is probably the most famous of all the metaphysical metaphors, where he's describing their love as being like the two legs of a compass, right? Not the compass you'd have in a boat to tell you which direction you'd go, but the pointy thing that you try to stick your classmate with when you were in geometry class. And right here, we can see how this is working as a metaphysical poem, right? I mean, we think of all the things that we might create metaphors from to describe love, and we'd think of nice things like flowers and bunnies and I don't know stars or something nice, not a, a compass that you'd use in a geometry class. If you can make that about love, boy, that is that unexpected metaphysical conceit, that strange comparison. And of course, that's exactly what Donne's going to do. And if we think about it, I only have this pen, so I'll try to demonstrate with this. I guess I could have probably have a compass out in my workshop somewhere. I use them actually for woodworking a fair bit, but I already started the video, so we'll use this. Okay, so if we think of this is going to be one leg of the compass. Imagine there's another leg coming down. Thy soul, the fixed foot, right? She's staying in England while he's traveling, makes no show to move. And if you think of him, if his foot is the one with the pencil on the end that's moving around, as it's turning to make that circle, this would be turning. If it's a piece of polished wood or metal, it wouldn't appear to be moving at all, but in fact, it would be moving in exact relationship to his movements. When he goes farther away, this will lean and hearken after it. And then when he gets closer, as that pencil comes in, grows erect as that comes home. And what we see is that the two legs of the pencil, like the two lovers, although they may be physically apart, they're always joined by something, and that connection right at the top would be their souls. That's kind of how metaphysical conceits work. They give us the unexpected, the sort of jarring metaphor. But this one, and you guys picked up on this, I suspect. Uh, this metaphor is taking us in a different direction too. It's it's very sexual. If you haven't figured that out yet, ask me in the discussion board, and I'll explain it as gently as I can, knowing that I'm creating a permanent record of what I write to you, and you won't see me blush. But uh, we can suffice it to say that Donne is not using the word erect accidentally, and we can think about what the legs of that compass are doing, and uh, the very end is actually a very the last line of the poem is actually uh, again a really explicitly sexual and fairly dirty reference that I'd probably be fairly embarrassed to explain to you. So this raises an interpretive question. Has this whole poem been a setup? And there are people who read it this way, right? That this poem is like one of that those cards that you can buy for Valentine's Day or an anniversary that has something like all sweet and lovey-dovey on the outside, and then you open it up and it says, some kind of vulgar sex joke. So it's kind of the setup, kittens and lovey-dovey stuff, and then the dirty joke on the inside. I don't know. I guess the Hallmark people make money from it. And there are people who think that that's how this poem works, right? That in fact we've been set up the whole time. We're reading this whole thing, we think, oh, look at all these metaphors and their loves and the soul and all the rest of it, and then we get to the end with the compass legs and the thing growing erect and all the it's like, oh, great. The whole thing just comes down to a dirty joke. But I don't think that's what the poem is doing. Instead, as I suggested in the first video, these metaphysical poems try to show us things and show us connections that are sometimes almost past the point of what we can articulate. They're the kinds of understandings that can only be expressed through metaphor. They become vehicles towards maybe not explaining, but gesturing toward what is ineffable, what's unknowable. The There's a wisdom within the poems that maybe couldn't be expressed through rational prose. And I think that's actually what Donne's doing in this poem. And that's what I want us to talk about on the discussion board. I think Donne is trying to make, in some ways, a very complicated statement about the nature of human love, which doesn't pit the physical desire and the assurance of a spiritual love, doesn't pit those in opposition. Those two manifestations of love, Donne wants us to suggest, are work in harmony and are, in a sense, interdependent on each other. And there are some hints that he gives us in the poem. One that I want you to think about is the line that we talked a little bit about during the discussion board. But we by a love so much refined that ourselves know not what it is. Now, the idea of the love being refined again plays into the idea of that upward gaze. They had this notion, and they were partially right. As one goes higher in elevation, we know that the air gets thinner, right? That's why that you have to have a cabin of an airplane pressurized, and why if you go to the top of a high mountain, you'll run out of breath really quickly, right? Because the air's thinner and you can't get as much oxygen from it. They thought that as you moved higher and higher in elevation, that you eventually transitioned from air to ether, which I guess would be a terrible greenhouse gas. I'm glad we don't do that. And then you would move into this kind of pure angelic substance that wasn't really substance at all. It was like immaterial matter. Donne, in fact, explored these ideas in one of his poems called Air and Angels. And the idea that as you ascend towards the very top, out of the atmosphere, as you move out of time, you move out of substance. So much refined. It's so refined because it's at that level above the moon in the ether, I guess, or in the angelic substance. It's the soul. They love this kind of metaphor. They thought of trees, the wood and roots is really dense. The lightest and airiest part of the tree is the leaves that grow on top. And people, where is our, let me not to the marriage of true minds, where is our minds? Well, the part that's aspiring upwards. They played with these metaphors constantly. By love so much refined, now pay attention to the next line, that ourselves know not what it is. That line, I think, actually helps us connect meaningfully all of the explicitly erotic and sexual and dirty parts of that last metaphor with the rest of the poem, showing us that this poem is not just a setup of here's something all cute and lovey and dovey and very nice and the kind of thing you would say in front of grandmothers at a friend's wedding to all of a sudden being a dirty joke, but rather that they're both expressions of the same thing. To get us to understand that, I'm going to ask you to think about one of those sort of philosophical questions. And this one will seem, when you first hear it, might seem like it's a dirty question, but it's actually not a dirty question. Can people love without their bodies? That's my question for you. And I want to start our discussion board tomorrow um, by thinking of that question, thinking of, I want to hear your answers to it. And then we're going to see if we can find ways of connecting the, uh, the ending of this poem with the beginning of the poem. That'll be our story for tomorrow. Okay, see you guys.